Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza, the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. Then you read the Financial Times, remember that you're reading a British newspaper. Britain has been Russophobic and at war with Russia essentially for more than 200 years. Britain hates Russia more than just about anything else Britain does. The U.S. foreign policy is based on a complete fantasy that the U.S. still runs the show or can run the show or can contain China. To my mind, this is all very dangerous and misguided. We need to avoid what John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Professor David Sachs. Professor Sachs is a renowned professor of economics at Columbia University. He's a best-selling author of many books, an educator, and he is someone who has worked over the years with governments from various parts of the world. Professor Sachs, welcome to India and Global Left.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You have been writing about the ongoing conflict in Palestine, and I wanted to start with the US role in this ongoing genocide in Gaza. The Biden administration has now bypassed the Congress twice to pass emergency armed packages, and this is despite a huge documentation about US bombs being dropped in Gaza consistently, including the 2,000 pounds bunker busters that has killed several hundreds. And then there are developments on the other sides, like 60% of Americans don't support Israel in this conflict. There is a new development of US organized labor that is increasingly withdrawing its support. There are constraints on the fiscal side as the US military spending has exceeded $1 trillion, including all the emergency packages. And yet we see a very confident Israel about the US support in this ongoing conflict. Explain to us this.
Well, I think the confidence is misplaced. It has been the fact for decades that the US political system has backed Israel pretty much unconditionally. But I think that this is no longer true. And I think the Israeli leadership calculations are mistaken. The public is very unhappy and very worried about the developments in Gaza. There's very strong opposition to what Israel is doing among younger people. Biden is suffering politically in terms of the opinion polls and election prospects as a result of the disarray of US foreign policy. So I think that if the Israeli government expects that this is the normal smooth ride, they will be mistaken. Now, it's true that there is a powerful pro-Israel lobby. There is a powerful support in the military-industrial complex. It has been the norm in the US Congress to appropriate funds for Israel pretty much without question. Politicians like Biden, who's an old man after all, have taken it for granted that a pro-Israel stand is always the right electoral as well as the right money-raising stand. But I think that this is a wrong assessment by US politicians because the public is not supportive. And it's a wrong assessment, especially by the Israeli politicians, who I think are making a very, very serious miscalculation.
Just to stay on this point, I mean, it is often said that while the American public has a huge leverage in terms of, or at least some leverage in terms of influencing its internal policies, when it comes to foreign policy, it is often said that what goes on in the public doesn't influence a lot in terms of the foreign policies. You have mentioned about the Jewish funding, but there are also talks about the American strategic.
Well, it's not just Jewish funding; it's Christian funding. It's
Yes.
there is a quite broad, and its military-industrial complex funding. It's quite a broad coalition.
Right, absolutely. And I was just coming to the broad region in general. We are seeing a lot of tension with it around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and rockets being fired by the Houthis, and then US-led coalition has sunk boats on the other side. And we are seeing constant firing across the Lebanon border since October 8, if not earlier. And effectively, Netanyahu's cabinet, from Gallant to Gantz to his finance ministry, Smotrich, they are essentially calling for war against Iran. Now, to my mind, it's very difficult, or it's almost inconceivable to think about this very extended war by Israel alone if there is no thinking that US is not going to support or back them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza is supported by U.S. munitions almost on a daily basis. So if the U.S. cuts support, Israel has to stop. Period. It's not a matter of extending to Lebanon, the Red Sea, Iran. That would be a major war. By the way, a major war not only for Israel, but a major war for the United States as well. And the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. There are crazy U.S. politicians like Lindsey Graham who loves war anytime, anywhere. And he said we need to bomb Iran. He used even more extreme language. But basically, this is not the position of the Pentagon, and it's not the position of the American people. You raised the question of whether the public has some say in foreign policy. In general, not very much. But being an election year this year, it's strange, but foreign policy is much more on the agenda because there's a sense that Biden is incompetent, has lost control, that the U.S. is pulled into too many conflicts. And this is weighing on public opinion, especially because Donald Trump has been against funding Ukraine and the
But not Israel, right?
The Republican base is really not in favor of this spending, or particularly in terms of these wars. It's complicated, but I think in general, the mood in the United States is, my God, we've got enough problems at home. What the hell are we doing getting into more and more and more of these wars? And Biden looks very weak and inconsequential, and he's a poor communicator in general. So this is a time when American public opinion is having an effect, especially in the Republican Party, which is not really wanting to fund Biden's adventures abroad.
I remember this foreign affairs column at the peak of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It was saying that we should bump up our support for NATO. It's not enough because the Republicans can come and they would definitely withdraw support, and we should keep this going. And we would come to Ukraine. But before that, if you could very quickly, if you could lay out this 8-point proposal that you laid out in one of your columns about how to achieve peace in the region.
Well, it's basically one point, which is I would like the UN Security Council today to vote the state of Palestine as a UN member state, and for that to be confirmed by the UN General Assembly, and to get on with the two-state solution. Of course, the current political constellation in Israel is dead set against this. It is absolutely intent on complete control, not only over Israel, but over Palestine. That's the real agenda. It's a self-destructive agenda as well as a deadly agenda vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. And I would like the international community to cut through this and say, look, we've had 57 years of resolutions now, or almost 57 years, UN Security Council Resolution 242. And this is that there need to be two states on the 4 June 1967 borders. And that's it. And we're moving to that solution because otherwise, well, there is no solution of peace. So this is not easy to do, but the alternatives are much worse, actually. So this is what I would recommend. Of course, then there would be peacekeepers, and that would be peacekeepers to separate the two sides, and that seems to me to be utterly feasible. There would be a normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab and Islamic neighbors, but based on Palestine being a sovereign state with control over Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Islamic holy sites. But this is what has been on the table for decades. And I would urge the international community to just move to this solution, because under the UN Charter, Security Council has the power to do this. It is in the interests of global peace to do this. There's one country that blocks it from happening, and that's the United States. And I'm hoping that when the overwhelming global opinion is on the other side, and when the alternative is so horrible as it is, and when the Israeli leaders are so vulgar and violent in their stated intentions, that this will also change the US position.
I want to move to Ukraine, but very quickly, if you can respond to just two additional questions on this. One is, as you mentioned about the Republicans either coming to power or taking charge of, or continuing charge of Congress, and that having some influence. I was wondering if there is a division between Republican policies or intent when it comes to Ukraine or Russia and when it comes to Palestine, because Donald Trump, for instance, during his presidency, while he was a dovish when it came to Russia, he was an absolute hawkish when it came to not just China, but also in Palestine. I mean, his policies were far more regressive than even some kind of moderate Obama. So that's one point. And the other point is many people now are increasingly disillusioned by the idea of the two-state settlement, two-state solution, given there are these 700,000 settlements and so on and so forth. Very quick response, because we have to discuss the rest of it.
Yeah, don't think of the Republican Party or even Donald Trump as having coherent, unified, consistent ideas, either internally consistent or consistent over time. These are political movements, and Donald Trump himself is not a stable personality. So don't look for consistency. When it comes to one-state solution or two-state solution, they're both possible. I think both parties would prefer a two-state solution. That is also international law. The settlements are illegal. The settlers would have to go home to a very large extent. When those settlements took place, they were known to be illegal. The UN Security Council has been very clear over the years that they are illegal. This is the tragedy. Israel tried to put facts on the ground. Well, it put facts on the ground that have led to disaster. That was predictable at the time. It's happening right now. We need an answer. Okay, they could live in one state, but not an apartheid state. That's not an answer for peace. Or they could live in two states. But if they live in two states, they have to solve the problem that hundreds of thousands of settlers, many of them highly religious zealots, listening to biblical ideas from 2,600 years ago, not current realities in the world, need to adjust to current realities. So this is tough. But the current situation, the status quo, is a complete disaster. So I'm saying go with international law, go with decades of international law, go with a solution that both sides claim they prefer to somehow forcing one state together, and therefore solve the problem even of the settlements.
Let's come to Ukraine. On December 30, the New York Times reports on an Ukrainian bombardment of the Russian city of Volgorod that killed 22 people, perhaps the deadliest single attack on a Russian city since the start of the war. And this has been followed up by what the New York Times reports as heavy barrage of hypersonic Russian missiles into cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv and others. So there seems to be a renewed conflict there. My question basically is and this is mostly from my reading of the Financial Times, there seems to be an uneasiness within European elites in particular about some sort of reluctance on part of Washington, D.C. about continuing this war in Ukraine. In fact, Financial Times columnists are writing columns encouraging Ukraine to come up with its own war industries because Washington might not help it anymore. Do you see this to be based on ground, or do you think it's a completely misplaced perception?
First, when you read the Financial Times, remember that you're reading a British newspaper. Britain has been Russophobic and at war with Russia essentially for more than 200 years. Britain hates Russia more than just about anything else Britain does. And Britain has been fighting the Crimean War since 1856. So this is just the Financial Times doing its normal thing. And the British media are even more outrageous than the US media. The fact of the matter is two things. One, this war should have and could have been avoided because it's a war over NATO enlargement, and the United States pushed NATO enlargement stupidly, naively, as a gamble, thinking it would get away with anything. It lost the gamble. That's point number one. Point number two is Russia is crushing Ukraine on the battlefield, and Ukraine is bleeding terribly with hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, and is outgunned, outmanned, out-technologied, and the U.S. And the West don't have even in their stockpiles right now the 155 millimeter shells and other equipment. Unless this thing goes nuclear, which would end the world, Russia is prevailing on the battlefield. It's a very straightforward, tragic, again, utterly predictable point. Let me be clear: the U.S. is completely incompetent in foreign policy. So these debacles are foreseeable. These are not retrospective ideas. The Financial Times is filled with nonsense if it thinks that Ukraine is going to fight this on its own. But what it's saying that the U.S. is not pursuing this is probably true. The Congress is going to return this month, most likely turning down further funding for Ukraine. I sure hope so. This funding doesn't do Ukraine any good. It just kills more and more people in Ukraine. It just keeps the war going. Of course, in the end, the military-industrial complex has a powerful lobby, and it may be able to keep another round of some level of aid. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. public is against continued funding. The war is not going the way that these fools in the administration believed that it would, or these gamblers believed that it would. And so I think we are in an end game, and there should be negotiations, just as there were negotiations last year in March and April 2022 that would have ended the war. But the United States said, no, you have to keep fighting because we want to keep enlarging NATO. It's pretty much as simple as that. We need to negotiate an end to the war based on no NATO enlargement.
If there is one voice who seems to be absolutely unwavering in not ending the war, is Zelensky. Like, he seems to be absolutely against ending the. Where does he get the confidence from?
Well, I don't know if it's confidence or desperation, or many people have said to me, he'd be killed if he tried anything different from the inside right wing, or like many politicians who have staked everything on a particular position, he can't back down because that would mean the immediate end of his power. I don't think it's confidence. I think it's complete desperation. And I think we're in an end game.
What's the alternative? What's the opposition to Zelensky that you can think of or imagine replacing in Ukraine?
Well, there could be a coup from inside. There could be a military defeat. There could be a rout on the battlefield. There could be an overthrow of the government. There could be a political change to any of the competitors like Zelensky or others. But the current situation is an end game. Ukraine is being absolutely ravaged and savaged on the battlefield right now. They're trying to mobilize people, basically grabbing them off the streets. It's terrible. I think the public support has disappeared. That's why Zelensky said no elections. So we're very close to the end game.
Let's come to the market transition in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You were very close in terms of the project in Poland, and you were involved in some of the early experiments in Russia before you had to back out, or you were probably pushed aside. Before I
No,
put,
no, 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 no.
yes.
Look, these weren't experiments. The idea was to stabilize a financial crisis and to help countries move to a normal mixed economy. In the case of Poland, that was tumultuous but very successful. It launched 30 years of rapid economic development in Poland and a lot of catching up of living standards and technology and so forth. But the reason was that Poland had a geopolitical support from the United States and Europe. The problem with Russia was that the United States viewed Russia as an enemy that it didn't want to support. And in fact, as soon as the Soviet Union went down, the hardliners in the United States, who became called the neocons, said, well, let's break up Russia too. And so the war against the Soviet Union never ended. It just carried on to a kind of war against Russia with NATO enlargement, with other actions to try to undermine Russia's security and its power. So I saw early on, I tried to get U.S. financial support to Gorbachev before the Soviet Union ended, and then to Yeltsin when Russia and the other 14 republics of the Soviet Union became independent states. But in neither case was there any interest in the United States for that kind of constructive approach. So I resigned. I resigned twice, actually. I resigned after the first year, and then the Russian government begged me, please help us one more year. And I tried again, and there was no interest in the last year of the Bush administration, then the first year of the Clinton administration. So I resigned again at the end of 1993. I wasn't pushed aside. I was just useless because what I believed needed to be done was geopolitical, which was to make a normal relationship between the US, Europe, and Russia. And in Poland, that was kind of second nature. But when it came to Russia, it was beyond the imagination or the intention of the US government.
So was it the US lack of cooperation that disillusioned you, or was it Yeltsin being able to push through some of these reforms because his parliament was vetoing some of what
Yeah,
you were suggesting?
this was essentially a geopolitical situation. When you're in such a big crisis, you have to find your place in the world first and foremost. There's a financial crisis. There's a crisis of an end of an empire, the Soviet Union. It's a dissolution of 15 countries. They need trade relations. They need finance. And the international institutions should have been there to help this function. The IMF should have played a role. But the IMF, of course, is on 19th in Pennsylvania, meaning that it's under the thumb of the United States. And the United States told the IMF, no, you don't help. And so this is really what this was about.
I want to ask you a few questions about some of the economic policies that you suggested, the bundle of which has now come to be known as shock therapy, and as you know, has increasingly come under attack, especially from the left. I want you to respond to some of these apprehensions or critiques, if you like. One of the things said is while some of your recommendations about deregulation of price controls, restoration of trade are uncontroversial, but essentially a very rapid deregulation of price control also meant what you suggested was a restrictive monetary policy, which was coupled with a very balanced budget, which led to a contraction of, which could possibly lead to a contraction of the economy. And then the second side is about the privatization, which often means, definitely in the case of Russia, is very cheap privatization. There was this biscuit factory which was privatized for seven.
Okay.
Yes.
Look, this is silly. This is not. This is not what I said, and my role had nothing to do with privatization. And so there's so much nonsense about this. I was trying to help prevent a hyperinflation and to help a financial stabilization, not through austerity, quite the contrary, but through financial support for Russia so that there wouldn't have to be that kind of austerity, and through a standstill on debt repayments and a large financing package. That's the opposite of what you're saying. I was not in any way advising even on the privatization issues, and my own advice, which was not asked for because that wasn't what I was there to be doing. I was there as a financial specialist that knows a lot about how to end a financial crisis. But my own advice was the opposite, which was to be careful, go slow, prevent the stealing of enterprises, don't privatize the major resource sector like oil and gas. It's very clear. So a lot of silliness was said, but the media is filled with silliness because we're talking here about technical issues, but things for various reasons were misunderstood. So basically, the bottom line is I was trying to avoid a macroeconomic financial crisis. I was following the basic line of John Maynard Keynes, which is that when a country's in financial crisis, it needs a framework of help from outside, not a framework of punishment. That was my basic idea. It's been my basic idea all along throughout my career. And when that international help comes in a timely way, it can make a very consequential and constructive improvement of what is otherwise a very deep crisis.
I'm glad you pushed back against the privatization thing, because I think, in all honesty, your package didn't include that. I still
not at all.
Yes.
So
yes, yes.
the whole thing's nonsense.
Definitely.
Sorry.
Yes. I'd still like you to very quickly respond to the balanced budget and restrictive monetary policy, which seems to be were part of your package.
The balance. I didn't ask for a balanced budget. I asked for a budget that was not based on monetary financing of a deficit for a large amount. In other words, I was saying, don't balance the budget, get large-scale financial help in order so that you don't have to, quote, balance the budget. It's the opposite. It was a financial package to give support in the midst of a crisis. You see, Russia had run out of money. They were in debt. They were supposed to be repaying the debt. I said to the G7, don't ask them to repay the debt. Are you kidding? This is a severe crisis. The G7 said, no, they have to repay every penny that's falling due. It's the opposite.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to the international side, you are definitely...
No. International side's about the budget, you understand.
But what about the fiscal deficit?
The fiscal deficit is exactly, if you give money to a budget, you allow it to run a deficit in a non-inflationary way. That's it. I was trying to help them run a deficit, you see?
Right.
I was trying to get them revenues so that they could continue all of the social functions, all of the normal functions, so that they would avoid a deep financial crisis. Exactly the opposite. I was the one saying 30 billion a year for the former Soviet Union coming from the outside. People thought I was crazy. What a bargain it would have been.
What's your general assessment of the post-communist transition in Eastern Europe? You have been very open about your thoughts on Poland. You see it as a successful experiment. What's your general thought about Eastern Europe's transition? Because there are apprehensions about Eastern Europe itself. Many people say even cities like Warsaw that didn't used to have beggars are now have many more. So what's your...
Are you kidding? Were you there? What? Come on, what nonsense. Look, in 1989 or 88, Poland was about a third of the per capita income level of Germany. Now it's about 70%. In other words, it's doubled relative to its German next door neighbor. That's what happens when you end the trade and finance barriers, integrate the economies, have Poland being a major industrial supplier for European industry. It became integrated into the normal European economy. That's the benefit of European Union membership. And by and large, it's geographic. If you're close to the Western European countries, you do better. If you're farther away, you do less well, because say a major company like Siemens or Volkswagen is looking for suppliers. It could go next door to Poland, or it could go farther to Romania and Bulgaria. Well, what will it do for its supply chain? It will tend to go closer. So there's a big geographic gradient in reform naturally, which is that the countries closest to the Western European countries did better. Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia. The ones that are farther away, like Romania and Bulgaria, did less well. The places where there was chaos, like the former Yugoslavia, did even less well. The places behind the former Soviet Union, in general, did even less well, except the Baltics were grabbed for both strategic reasons and because of their very small size and integrated into the Northern European economic matrix very quickly. So there's a lot of basic economic geography overlaid with geopolitics in this. That's the basic story.
Can I leave you with one final question, if your time permits? There is a lot being spoken about the future of US-China relationship, and that has a huge implication for the rest of the world. Can you share your thoughts about how you look at this relationship going forward?
Well, the big issue is China has become a superpower in every dimension, economic, technological, military, obviously population, though it's number 2 to India. But essentially, that's fine It means that the major powers, China, India, European Union, United States, should be cooperating with each other and finding a good modus vivendi. But in the American mentality, America needs to be number one. America needs to have dominance. So the U.S. foreign policy is based on a complete fantasy that the U.S. Still runs the show or can run the show or can contain China. And so this is the root of the extreme tensions between the US and China, basically US resentment at China's success. And the US is therefore trying to hinder China, trying to contain China, trying to slow China's rise, trying to organize military alliances against China. To my mind, this is all very dangerous and misguided. China is just having a return to economic success. And it should be applauded, not opposed. So I'm for a cooperative, multipolar, multilateral approach. India is going to be the same situation right now. India and the U.S., say that they are close in foreign policy, but when India gets too powerful and successful, the United States will turn against India too. So basically, we need to avoid what John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. And he says it's inevitable that there should be conflict among great powers because they fight for each other for survival. I say to him, John, we don't need tragedy, we need cooperation. So countries should cooperate with each other, stop the bullying. If the United States never again used the phrase rule-based international order, it would be too soon, because that just has become the code stock phrase for the US-led order. We don't need a US-led order. We need a multipolar, multilateral order, starting with the UN Charter. I'd like to see India join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. It obviously should be there. So we need some reforms of the UN system, but basically we need multilateralism, not great power showdowns. But the United States, for the moment, is still in a mentality of thinking it's the indispensable leader of the world, which is nonsense. It's just 4% of the world population. We've, by the way, gotten enough problems internally and domestically, politically, economically, and socially, that we have a lot of healing to do in the United States without trying to run the rest of the world.
Did you convince Professor Mearsheimer? Because he seems to be believing that the idea of US hegemony is something indispensable or the whole world will fall into chaos. What did he respond to you?
He doesn't say it quite that way. What he says is that it's inevitable that the US will seek hegemonic power, that that's the tragedy of great power politics, that great powers are inevitably led to seek either regional or even global hegemony. I say no. We don't agree on that. We're good friends. I admire him enormously, but we don't agree because if you write a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, my view is you have to solve the tragedy. You can't just leave it as a tragedy. We have to say, okay, that's the risk. What's the solution? John says, well, there is no solution. That's the reality. And I say, no, there is a solution. The solution is multilateralism and multipolarity.
On that note of optimism, Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time. It has been a pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, thanks a lot. Great to be
Have a
with you.
wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. The last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Arabia now offering not only to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia, but Israel and Palestine. This hardly gets attention in the United States media. But around the world, the headlines are far more, there are far more headlines about this. Talk about the significance of this, and if you see a direct parallel between all the headway that China is making and increasing U.S. hostility towards China.
Thanks, Amy. Very good to be with you. And indeed, this is a crucial topic. And as President Xi Jinping said in that meeting with Macron, it is a historic watershed that the world is living through right now. What China is after, if we view it from China's perspective, is what was also said, true multilateralism. And what that means, or true multipolarity, another term that they use. And that means they don't want a US-led world. They want a multipolar world. And the basis of that is that the United States is 4.1% of the world population. China is 17.5% of the world population. China's economy is comparable to the US economy, and indeed China is the lead trade partner for much of the world. So China is saying, we're there too, alongside you. We want a multipolar world. We don't want a US-led world. And while the United States sometimes talks about a rule-based order, the fact of the matter is that the US grand strategy, if we can use that term of the grand strategists of the US state, see our grand strategy in the United States as being dominance. And I often refer to an article that I think is very clear, succinct, and revealing by a former colleague of mine at Harvard University, Robert Blackwell, an esteemed ambassador of the United States, who wrote in 2015, and I'll quote from the article, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." Well, China doesn't want the United States to be the preeminent power. It wants to live alongside the United States. Blackwell, writing in 2015, said China's rise is a threat to US preeminence. And he laid out a series of steps that the Biden administration actually is following almost step by step. What Blackwell laid out already back in 2015 is that the United States should create, quote, new preferential trading arrangements among US friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China. There should be a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, a buildup of, quote, power political capacities of US friends and allies on China's periphery, and strengthen US military forces along the Asian rimland despite any Chinese opposition. This has become the Biden foreign policy. China knows it. China really is pushing back. But what's very important and interesting to understand, and we've seen it clearly in the dynamics involving the Ukraine war, most of the world also does not want the US as the global preeminent power. Most of the world wants a multipolar world and is therefore not lined up behind the United States sanctions on Russia and so forth. And this was also the message of President Lula visiting China, saying to President Xi Jinping, we as Brazil also want multipolarity, true multipolarity, and we want peace for example, in the Russian-Ukraine war that is based on not a U.S. perception of dominance, say NATO enlargement, but rather a peace that reflects a multipolar world. This is real. It's happening all over the world. And the fact of the matter is, the reason why this is a historic watershed is that the underlying economics and technological change have made it so. The U.S. is no longer the dominant world economy. And the G7, which is the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, is actually smaller than the BRICS countries in economic size, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So we really are, in fact, in a multipolar world, but in ideology, we're in a conflict.
But Jeffrey Sachs, I wanted to ask about that. You mentioned the BRICS. The BRICS Bank that is now in China, and President Lula has named Dilma Rousseff as the head of the BRICS Bank. Its importance in terms of this multipolarity in the world economies, the potential for even the creation of alternative major currencies to the dollar as a result of the BRICS alliance, the impact of that on world affairs.
This is a big deal. And in fact, the United States is withdrawing. It doesn't know it necessarily. Our politicians don't understand this, but our politicians are withdrawing from the world financial and monetary scene and opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things, because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi, we'll trade in rubles, we'll trade in rupees, we'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. the issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent 5. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change, or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table. Eu acho que essa guerra já passou da conta. O Brasil já fez a crítica que tinha que fazer.
I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had the, I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200-kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli, and yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written by all of us, not rules written just by the United States.
And Jeff Sachs, we only have a few, about a minute left, but I was wondering if you could comment on the parallels between this expansion of NATO further and further east in Europe. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, of President Monroe declaring to all the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to them attempting to move their forces and their militaries into Latin America. And for these past 200 years, Latin America has essentially been the major sphere of influence of the United States. And yet here we are saying that Russia has no right to declare that its immediate the countries in immediately its borders cannot cannot welcome in NATO troops?
Well, yes, a little empathy would go a long way and would have spared us actually a lot of wars. But for Americans, it would be useful to think, suppose Mexico made a military alliance with China. Would the United States say, well, that's Mexico's right, what are we going to do about it? Or might there be actually an invasion in short order or something like that? I would strongly advise to China and Mexico, don't try it at home. Don't experiment with this. But the United States government refuses that empathy because, in other words, refuses to put itself in the position of the other side. That's the fundamental arrogance of thinking that you determine the rules of the world. The problem with arrogance is not only the comeuppance from it, but you stumble into terrible crises that you don't even understand because the United States has not been allowed, the public has not been allowed to even think from the perspective of the other side. So the analogy is actually a very, very clear analogy. It is what China and Russia and others say all the time is, why have those double standards? Why don't we actually deal with them? They're not looking at the real history. So this is a game of narratives right now. The U.S. wants power, and it wants to expand its military empire. It wants NATO wherever it wants, and it's determined to get it to the last Ukrainian. So this is a game of propaganda. This is not serious analysis or serious history that is being discussed in the United States. I think many people in the U.S. do not trust the media or do not trust the government, and they're right.
In the spring, you gave an interview to the Slovak TV station TA3, in which you called for the start of peace negotiation. The Slovak Television Broadcasting Authority subsequently evaluated the interview due to an alleged possible violation of the program's objectivity and impartiality. The program was pulled from the Internet Archive, and the television eventually terminated its cooperation with the presenter. What do you say to such a procedure in a country of the European Union that describes itself as a democratic?
Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed, actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it, and we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better, but they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's That's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from. So we're not going to cross that.
And
It's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
how do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? You know, the United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel, because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society. Are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the U.S. and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and the Europeans don't understand this, because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the U.S. and Russia, NATO enlargement, U.S. power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the US government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of US dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
And now, for last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly, you are an economist, yes. So we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat. That it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States? And what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics, which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet, and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights. We may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the first-class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling, was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. is only 4% of the world population. So it can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy, though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
Originally, the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political. The BRICS started to meet with each other: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, why? Because they had one major thing in common other than being emerging economies, and that was they didn't want the U.S. as the hegemonic power. It was really annoying for all of them to have the United States say, we're the world leader, we're the sole superpower, we're the indispensable country, we make the rules-based system. Which rules? Our rules. So that's what united the BRICS, was annoyance, actually, with the arrogance of U.S. liberal hegemonists or neocons. They made the BRICS. Actually, even it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very clever strategist for the U.S. power, wrote, when he wrote The Global Chessboard in 1997, he said the one unthinkable thing is for the U.S. to push Russia and China together. But because of American arrogance, that's exactly what America did every day, step by step, for the next 25 years. And that's what made the BRICS. And I think that's what basically unites the BRICS. On the one side, they're united because, well, they're important economies, and the BRICS are now larger than the G7 in purchasing power measured terms. So that's a big deal. But I think the other thing is geopolitical, which is the BRICS really say, we're big powers. We want a multipolar world. We don't want the U.S. surrounding us with military bases. That's the Russian view. That is the Chinese view. Brazil says, come on, don't interfere in South America the way you do, saying we're going to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which was another stupid U.S. idea of the last 10 years. And so Brazil, in a different way, because it's not a superpower like China or Russia, it's not a nuclear power, but it still says, give some space to our region. We don't want the U.S. dictating to us. China's quite interesting because China triangulates. I don't mean China, sorry, India. India is quite interesting because India really triangulates. They have their tensions, even border disputes, of course, with between India and China. And the United States says, okay, we'll be your partner. You just have to oppose China. But India is also, of course, a great civilization. It was colonized by Britain for centuries. And it's not about to say, yes, United States, you run the world. So India fits in this mold in a very interesting way as well, basically as the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so, and we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West or Western Europe or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. There's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one, yeah? So I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange. over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe, but the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed, and that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, oh, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the number one dumbest idea that I've heard. You know, for NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the BRICS currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the BRICS as the integration can get inspired by Europe, by special drawing rights, probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them? What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the BRICS countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles, they may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF. I think what all of this war shows is that the UN is really in a damaged state when it comes to war and peace because of the way that the Security Council functions. And I have my modest proposal taken from the principles of the Catholic Church, and that is that we should lock them in a room, the 15 members, and tell them that they cannot come out until there's white smoke over the 38th floor and they have negotiated an end to this war. That's their job. They're not doing their job at all, not even remotely doing their job, not even seeing it as their job. And that is really a dire warning for the world, actually. It is the job of the UN Security Council to negotiate. But what I've observed is there are no negotiations. There's only speeches to the camera right now. And it's only taken as a game for the news cycle. It's not discussions, it's not negotiations. And it is very dangerous that it operates like that.
Is there any international institution left which could function as a forum which is accepted by all the warring parties? I mean, the UN is definitely out of the question. The loss of credibility, according to me, is huge due to this behavior you just described. But is there any international institution left that could bring that could fix this terrible situation?
No, but what there is a phone call between Biden and Putin that could end this. And I keep offering to give them a Zoom link if they want to talk to each other. They could borrow my cell phone. The biggest disappointment of, well, maybe that's a strange way to put it, a profound reality of this war is that since February 24th, 2022, Putin and Biden have not spoken one time, not even one time. All they have to do is send a Zoom link. They could talk with each other, even if they disagree. This is unbelievably irresponsible of Biden, first of all, in my opinion, but of the two, talk with each other. That's all. Disagree, yell at each other, but talk with each other, because you can't end the war without talking. And this is a war between the US and Russia. Of course, it's the Ukrainians dying, but this is a war between the US and Russia.
In one of your podcasts, very impressive, about the Kennedy speech, the peace speech you mentioned before, you said that one crucial element was that Kennedy and Khrushchev were talking to each other. They installed even this telephone line. I have a photograph of that telephone here in my office, the most communication device of humanity. If I take this, I get the impression that we have a tremendous leadership crisis, especially in the West. We have a leadership in the West who is living in a way of a bunker or in a cave, where they seem to be hypnotized by their own images of the other side, of the enemy, and they start to believe their own cave paintings in their caves, to use this metaphor.
Yes.
And a lot of friends of mine and colleagues say we really have a leadership crisis in the West. And can you comment on that? I mean,
I can. If you
sure.
Give me a moment, let me get a book down off my shelf. Hold on.
Of course.
This book is called the Kennedy-Khrushchev Letters. Mm-hmm. When Kennedy became president, Khrushchev sent him a congratulatory note, and Kennedy proposed, why don't we open a back channel communication in text? It wasn't with the phone yet, and we'll write to each other. And I promise you, Chairman Khrushchev, I will never make public anything, and only a few of my closest aides will see this. So we'll keep it very much just for myself and a few absolute close aides, and you can do the same, but let's have a channel of communication. And these letters are astoundingly interesting and important. There are a large number of them. I don't remember the count. More than 100 of these. And they're incredible to read. For example, I was just reviewing after the US invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, Khrushchev wrote in the back channel to Kennedy, rogue elements of your government are committing acts of piracy in your name, and Mr. President, you need to stop this. And Kennedy wrote back a disgraceful letter, actually, one of the worst of his career, in my view. Mr. Khrushchev, this has nothing to do with us. This isn't really the United States, so don't misinterpret. And Khrushchev wrote, so that was on April 18, I think it is. And then Khrushchev wrote back, basically, to paraphrase, Mr. President, don't ever lie to me like that. This is an American action, and don't talk to me like that. And you need to stop this international crime. And first of all, very human letters. Khrushchev sending the alarm, Kennedy brazenly lying, Khrushchev responding, "Don't you dare lie to me." And they were off and running. And it was that relationship actually that saved the world in the end, because they were really talking with each other, sometimes deeply arguing. And of course, at the Vienna summit in 1961, Kennedy had a hard time as Khrushchev really pounded on him. But they regarded each other as human beings and able to talk with each other. And that makes a big difference in this world. And one of the absolute worst ideas, disgraceful ideas of American rhetoric is you can't talk to a person like Putin. That's like Munich 1938. So Munich 1938 supposedly teaches America never negotiate with the other side. That's appeasement. And that is actually one of the beliefs, deep beliefs in this fantastical American foreign policy, which is even talking is a terrible, terrible appeasement. And
but this strikes me as completely absurd, because I mean, the Americans, the Germans, they were talking to the Soviets, and whatever you can say about Putin, I mean, the Soviet Union had a gulag. The Soviet Union had,
of course, Stalin. And they not only were they talking, they were making,
but they were still talking to them.
They were making arms agreements.
If you talk to Mao, you can talk to Putin. Putin is compared to a Mao. Putin is like a Nobel Peace Prize winner compared to a guy like Mao or Stalin. And I mean, they were collaborating. They were working together against Hitler.
Exactly. No, it's just, it's so immature, so misguided. And I see it all around me. And by the way, it leads to all these useless wars. Yeah. So it's not as if there are no consequences. The consequences are before our eyes. Yeah. This is no way to have diplomacy. That's what I was trying to tell these people in the White House. Behave. If you behave, you can avoid the war.
But at the end of the day, one has to say, to bringing in a fair account of events, I share a lot of your views, basically all of them. But one thing strikes me still. I think that Putin, there was a certain sense of recklessness. He thought he could get away with it as well. When he saw the Americans running in Afghanistan, he saw in Berlin, there is a new government with inexperienced people. Putin doesn't take seriously Macron in France. Probably Putin extremely underestimated this kind of woke response, this kind of woke foreign policy, this emotional foreign policy that the whole West, or basically, I mean, the Americans, would strike back so hard that they would defend the Ukraine. Don't you see a certain sense of megalomania on the side of Putin as well when he went into the Ukraine?
No, I wouldn't say megalomania, but what I would say is that each side is playing a game of chicken, and each side has underestimated the response on the other side. Because the US thought it could get away with everything just in 2014. It would be enough to throw Yanukovych out, and now we'll have a pro-Western government and we'll do everything we want to do. They miscalculated. Putin grabbed Crimea. Then in 2021, Putin thought massing the troops on the border would be enough to get Biden to negotiate. By the way, it should have been. There was because the terms for the negotiation were perfectly plain and reasonable, but it didn't work. Then Biden thought, okay, it's a bluff. Putin will not do this. Okay, Putin then called the bluff, thinking, you know what, we'll force them to the negotiating table. And interestingly, within days, Zelensky was at the negotiating table.
He was tweeting about neutrality in
Exactly.
last April. Zelensky was
No,
tweeting.
but as early as
could be.
exactly as early as March, just a few days
Right.
after the start. So that was Putin's idea. Okay, then Biden said, no. The sanctions will kill them. And so I remember I spoke to people in the U.S. Treasury. Oh, it's going to be devastating, you know. So they thought that would blow off Putin. Each side has been doing this. Then, you know, they thought, okay, Putin will never mobilize politically, the backlash and so forth. Then he mobilized a few 100,000 additional troops in the summer of 2022. So this is a game of chicken with escalation. And the fundamental problems with it are what Obama noted in 2014, which is Russia has escalatory dominance, which is that for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's incidental. And so this is the fundamental problem with the Western position. And that's why we're in a disaster. And the biggest puzzle in all of this is, for me, it's not even a puzzle anymore, but it's the biggest tragedy is Ukraine doesn't have the wherewithal to recognize that it needs to save itself from this game of these two escalating superpowers.
Is President Zelensky, who is almost depicted as a saint in our media, isn't Zelensky an extremely irresponsible leader of his country?
He will be regarded in history as a disaster. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting that at the moment it's the total opposite, but I notice the atmosphere is changing. People are losing a bit their patience with him. But I mean, I took so much time of you, but I would like, if you allow me,
if Zelensky had just followed through in March 2022, he would have done his job for his country. But the United States intervened and said, no, don't make that agreement. And he went with the US, and that's where he failed.
Allow me to put the global perspective to the last part of the interview. I don't want to take too much of your precious time, but it's so interesting. Do we enter a new chapter in current history? Meaning 30 years ago, the fall of the Iron Curtain, globalization, free trade, an explosion of wealth, development of backwater countries. I mean, you are a development economist. A lot of countries gained a lot of wealth due to this interconnectivity, or whatever you want to call it. And now we are entering what I would call an absurd version of a Cold War. Is that ahead, or is that hyperbole?
We don't know what kind of world we're entering yet. What I believe is that the underlying reality is we're already in a post-American and post-Western world. We're in a truly multipolar world. We're in a world where the BRICS countries are larger than the G7 countries.
Turkey wants to join. Even Turkey and Greece want to join the BRICS countries.
So, in my view, we've already moved to a world in which the underlying economic, demographic, and technological capacities mean that this is not the world of the 19th and 20th century dominated by the West, but this is a bigger world with multiple major powers in it. And one of the points of all of this is the United States does not accept that transition. The United States still believes that this is ultimately a US-led world with two recalcitrant actors, Russia and China, and all the rest will come along to understand the realities. And the US, in my opinion, is a quarter century out of date. But being at the institutions of American power, Harvard and the East Coast of the US, I know what people say and think and talk, and I think they're just a quarter century out of date. So that is our big geopolitical challenge, is that the mental models of the major powers and the realities are not aligned. And Europe is a big disappointment in this, because there isn't one voice in Europe right now that has a geopolitical outlook that is really even intelligible, basically. So this is, to me, both natural, that this is a war that shows the limits of American power, which are not the world leader, but a very powerful country among many, or among a few at least. And the biggest surprise is the incapacity of Europe to have a coherent understanding of the situation. But what kind of world we're heading towards really is an open question, because we could be heading towards a world of massive conflict and disaster, or we could actually head towards a world where some intelligent, non-octogenarian leader in the United States arises and says, NATO, we don't need it so much anymore. But what we do need is to have normal relations with China, with India, with Russia, with Brazil, with the EU. And then suddenly things would look really quite different. So where we're heading is not, I believe, either set in stone or even easily predictable. We have this geopolitical crisis. We have a technology disruption, which is profound. We have an ecological disruption, which is profound. And how we manage this is the biggest question. And the war in Ukraine is a tragic sideshow to the big issues. But in a way, I sometimes compare it to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Augustus learned in 9 AD, okay, the Roman Empire, it's big, but we don't have to actually go all the way into Germania. Maybe we'll just stop here. And it's a good lesson, by the way, because the Roman Empire did quite well for centuries onward without having to continue to try to conquer the German tribes. And I think this is kind of a Teutoburg Forest for the US, or should be seen as one, which is, okay, that's the limit of NATO enlargement. These are the new limits. This is the lines of Europe now. It extends through Eastern Europe, but it doesn't go across to Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on. And now let's learn to live in such a world.
What do you say to people who describe the situation right now as a global conflict between democracies and autocracies, and China being the ultimate enemy of the West?
When I first heard that, I regarded it as worse than a kindergarten story. I could not believe a president of the United States would say such an idiotic thing. To see that it's part of actual U.S. foreign policy discourse is to show what I think the failings of American higher education are. But it could not be stupider. Period.
Yeah. And let's talk.
Am I being clear?
Yeah. Let's talk for a moment about the United States. I mean, we read a lot of disquieting news. For example, you have a lot of homeless people in some cities. You have an explosion, it seems, of criminality. You have infighting in the political class, extremely divided, the Democrats against the Republicans. What is your assessment of the United States? In what shape are the United States at the moment, which still, I have to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the US, and the US has always been an inspiration for Swiss people, of course, for our family. But still, there are some disturbing news one reads. But what is your impression as an American and insider?
Basically, for the last 40 years, the U.S. has not been able to reach any kind of social democratic agreement on any issue of society's problems. So by that I mean, what happened roughly 40 years ago, the U.S. political system was completely hacked by lobbying and campaign contributions, and the Supreme Court opened the doors to the massive corruption of the U.S. political system. So all of our politics are in the hands of powerful groups. Finance is in the hands of Wall Street. The healthcare sector is in the hands of the big health insurance industry. The energy sector is in the hands of big oil to a very large extent. The foreign policy is in the hands of the military-industrial complex. It's all been parceled out. And the problem is not polarization in between red and blue states. It's not the tribal divisions between the Republicans and the Democrats. Basically, both parties serve their campaign financiers. They're the same for both parties. We're pretty deeply entrenched in all of our politics right now. Nothing changes year to year. And the social conditions underlying the society have deteriorated markedly over the last 30 years, predictably. And the best gauge of that deterioration is that our life expectancy now is around the level of 1996. So we've had a decline of several years of life expectancy. It's 76 years, according to the most recent calculations. And that shows a society that is really in bad political health as well as social health. And I live in New York City. It's filled with garbage and homelessness right now. I mean, just the management of the city on a daily basis is a much bigger challenge than it was 20 years ago. And it's obvious the things to do because Europe does most of them, and the United States can't do anything because the rich people who pay for the government don't want to pay taxes, and that's the end of the story. So it's we're just paralyzed in this. And when the Democrats are in office, nothing happens, and when the Republicans are in office, nothing happens, and that's really where we are on our social politics. And it's not red and blue states. That's a kind of game of daily social media. It's very uninteresting, the politics, actually. It's very clear, very predictable, and very much hacked.
What do you think of Donald Trump? I mean, is he a man who could make America great again, or is he a danger for American democracy?
Look, Biden is a danger for American democracy. Trump is a danger for American democracy. What are we doing with octogenarian leaders right now? Period. I'm aghast at the Biden administration. I was aghast at the Trump administration. I was profoundly disappointed with the Obama administration. I was absolutely aghast at the Bush Jr. administration. During my whole lifetime, there's been one president that I think bears high respect, and that's John Kennedy. And he made his early blunders, and then he became a great man, and then they killed him. And beyond that, Johnson, no thank you. Nixon, no thank you. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter's very nice man, very not effective. Ronald Reagan, no thank you. George Bush Sr. had his moments and then dropped the ball. Clinton was really so amateurish and dilettantish in governance. George Bush Jr. was a disaster. Obama was, those 8 years went by and nothing happened. He was, you felt he wouldn't do something completely awful, and he didn't. He was level-headed, but didn't lead to any change because the system is just blocked. Trump, completely unstable, and Biden, an octogenarian neocon. You know, what more could you want?
What does it say about the American political system that you have still in the polls a highly rated former president who is attacked by attorneys, who is involved in a whole array of criminal law, criminal cases? I follow this, from a lot of distance, but I think it's always a bit a dangerous symptom if political fights are, fought on the courts, that they start
of
to
course.
attack.
Of course.
How do you assess that? I mean, what does it stand for? What kind of
what it means? The main thing is Americans do not trust their institutions anymore. That's the dominant fact. Americans do not trust their institutions, and the reason is government operates by lies, and that's terrible. And if you do that pervasively, you end up with the Congress with a trust rating of 10% of the public, something like that. And this collapse of trustworthiness started with the assassination of President Kennedy and the lies that were told about it. And then it was followed by Watergate and Vietnam War and one war after another based on lies. And so the American people are deeply unhappy. The political system has proven to be corrupted and unable to reform itself. And the main lesson I would take from this is don't have a presidential system, by the way. You have a parliamentary system. At least you get the parties have to discuss with each other and negotiate something, and it's a little bit more stable than what we have.
Do you think that the relationship between Russia and Europe is now destroyed for a very long time, or can that be repaired in a foreseeable future?
Not only can it be repaired, it will be repaired. And it's a tip of, I want to read one more of my favorite lines from Kennedy. When Kennedy spoke at the Irish Parliament in July 1963, he said, "Indeed, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet." And this is very wise. There are no permanent enemies. Russia's not going away. It's 11 time zones. It's a major power in the world. It is a trading country. It is a European country. It is part of European culture and history. And all that's said right now, for example, the New York Opera canceling a Russian soprano because of the war. This is happening, but it's mindlessly stupid, and it will be short-lived. And it's important to remember that in the Crimean War, And this is the second Crimean War. It's just the second Crimean War. In the first Crimean War, which ended in 1856, by 1871, pretty sure it's by 1871, France and Russia were allies again because of the rise of Germany. And so, time to change partners again. And so what had been this, dramatic fight in Palmerston wanted to end Russia and dismember Russia. Soon, France and Russia were allies, and France was pumping finance into Russia again. So this is not the end of anything, of course, and it should come back much sooner than people think.
A bit out of context, a very short question. How do you interpret this coup in Niger? What is this about? Is this a new kind of what is it? An African awakening, or what is it? Is it just a local event? Or?
I think it is. It is clearly three things. One is it's poverty, because the Sahel is impoverished, and impoverished places where I've been working for more than 40 years, they're unstable. And so this is, and I have always said, by the way, the number of speeches I've given to say, we need a program for the Sahel, to help water, food, and so forth. Okay, so that's one part. Second, it's clearly, the end of the French role. We're still in the final waves of decolonization in West Africa, and remaining French privileges are going to be pushed aside. It took longer time because of the poverty, basically, but this really is an anti-colonial action, and it finds a lot of support on the street. Definitely, and you see it, that it's not just Niger, it's Burkina, it's Mali, and it's anti-French for sure.
A good sign, a good, in that sense, a good development.
It is what happened in every part of the world, but it's happening later in Africa because the dependency was higher, the poverty was higher. And then the third part is it quickly became, within 2 days, new geopolitics because of Wagner and Russia and everything else. So it's dangerous. And what the right answer to this, actually, which I uselessly proposed this immediately, was how about an economic development program for the Sahel? God forbid people should live with the chance of, with some chance. And as usual, nobody, and I will push this in the UN for whatever it's worth, but the normal response is this has nothing to do with that. This has, where the army's going to be, will ECOWAS intervene? If you want, it doesn't even matter right now who's in charge. It doesn't matter really how the politics is. What matters is these are places of hunger, of drought, of lack of infrastructure, of lack of schooling, of no budgets, and we should do something about it because people should not live in that condition.
You have just spent, I think, 1 year in Europe, in Vienna, and
yes,
in some other places. What is the most important take you have from this stay in Europe? What's your dominant impression of the state of Europe?
I was very disappointed because most of Europe's leaders are right now simply following whatever the United States says, and whether this is because of their belief in Europe's security, whether it's their belief that the US will punish them if they deviate from the line. The state of European politics is quite bad, and the war has made things worse because Europe is with a dominant narrative like the United States that is basically given by the US security establishment and then repeated in the mainstream media in Europe. So it was, at a political level, really disappointing. At a personal level, it was wonderful. Vienna is a fantastic place. It is the result of decades of social democratic philosophy and ethos and social housing, and we had a fabulous time. And I also came to admire more and more the wise decision of both the Soviet Union and Austria in 1955 to make a very good deal, that the Soviets would leave Austria and the Austrians would declare neutrality, and that this would be the basis going forward. And it proved its great worth. And I tried to sell that approach for free to give the advice to Ukraine repeatedly, but they didn't understand that it's much better to be a neutral Austria than a NATO aspirant partner of the United States. As Henry Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And Ukraine has believed that the U.S. is going to provide security, and what the U.S. is providing is the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Your Austrian neutrality makes us Swiss a little bit proud, because in the constitution of Austria it says they want to have a neutrality Swiss style.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, that Switzerland was the role model for neutrality in Austria. What's your relationship with Switzerland?
And this is, Switzerland, of course, extremely smart, and it served Switzerland very well. It served Austria very well, and ironically, it served Sweden and Finland very well. And they abandoned this this year, shockingly naively, thinking that Russia's about to invade Finland or Sweden. No. And all of the benefits of neutrality they gave up overnight because of these right-wing parties that don't understand or pretend not to understand the current geopolitics.
Even in Switzerland, there are people in the establishment who think that neutrality has to be given up, or neutrality has to be made more flexible, that Switzerland can deliver weapons to one party in the war. What do you say about that? I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, should Switzerland give up neutrality? Would that be a wise course?
No. There's nothing more to add. Switzerland's one of the most successful countries of modern history. Why would you give up the basis of success?
Ja, as Goethe said, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Good days are hard to bear, and sometimes if you're very successful, you start to forget what made you successful.
Well, it's interesting. Every day I walk by Goethe on the Ringstrasse in Vienna, because he's got a big statue just near the opera house. And so I paid respect to Goethe every day.
Okay. You have been commenting, of course, the war in Ukraine in the recent months extensively. How do you assess the situation at the moment? Give us a brief oversight of your perception.
I think it's probably accurate, or roughly accurate, that about 40,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 months of what is a failed counteroffensive promoted by the United States. So this has been a disastrous period. Ukraine will not achieve on the battlefield its goals. This was clear from the very beginning, but the US has always said otherwise. And remember, I'm 68 years old, so I've heard the fairy tales of US generals for more than 6 decades. They always say, yes, success is just around the corner. this next offensive is going to be great. The surge is going to be decisive, and so forth. So I've heard this so many times in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and heard it again in Ukraine. What's very sad is that Ukraine is being destroyed in this process because the US has wanted to push Ukraine to NATO, and Russia, for completely predictable and understandable reasons, said no. And the United States believed that Russia was bluffing, or that if not bluffing, that it had no alternative but to bend to the US will. And this has not been the case. And Biden is not a very clever man, unfortunately, and his team is not very clever. Obama was more clever than Biden. And Obama knew in 2014, though Obama helped to start this disaster when the US helped to overthrow Yanukovych, Obama knew at that time, don't go deeper into this, because as he said in an interview, Russia has escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, Russia will escalate. And the reason is, for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice if Ukraine were in NATO? We would control the Black Sea. That's nice. But for Russia, it's absolutely existential. And so Obama already understood in 2014, don't escalate, because Russia will continue to escalate. You can't bluff Russia out of this. Biden, who's not very clever, just thought, well, what will Putin do? We'll just keep pushing. And when Putin put on the table in December 2021 a draft agreement for security arrangements between the US and Russia, by the way, I called the White House to say, negotiate. This is absolutely negotiable. I was told, no, we're not going to negotiate. And the US told Russia, no, not interested in negotiating. NATO is none of your business. It was literally the line. And Putin said, it is my business, and has shown it. And this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. Probably the population has declined by maybe 10 million from emigres on the one hand, or the Russia-controlled territory on the other hand. And the bloodbath continues. And NATO has, I won't even say NATO, this is a small group in the US leadership. They have no answer, but they have the election coming up in November 2024. So they think they need to continue this so as not to show weakness or defeat. This is where we are right now. It's a complete tragedy for Ukraine.
How will it play out? I mean, it's always hard to say, of course, to look into the future, but what is the most probable outcome you see in this war?
There will be ongoing large-scale killing and destruction until honesty prevails. And honesty will mean that the US will be clear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is not going to take place and not going to happen, and it's not an objective, and then the fighting will stop. And when the fighting stops, there will be major territorial issues. One, I think, was fated from the beginning, and that is that Crimea will remain in Russian hands, as it was and has continued to be Russia's naval base in Sevastopol since 1783. It's not going to Ukraine, other than it's not going to Ukraine, period. And then the issues of the Donbass and Kherson district and Zaporizhia. This is really a mess right now, because in December 2021, we should remember Russia was making no territorial claims, even for the Donbass. What Russia was calling for was honoring the Minsk agreements. And the US stupidly and Ukraine stupidly wouldn't honor agreements that had been signed and backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. Well, Russia is now dismantling the country geographically. And with so many losses on the Russian side, the belief that, well, okay, we'll just go back to where we were is a little naive. So this is a mess. I don't have any clear answer. What I've said every day from December 2021 until now is sit down and negotiate, because it's getting worse. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying at a rate of maybe 1,000 a day right now, or 1,000 dead and seriously wounded. And this is absolutely disastrous.
The dominant narrative, even in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Europe, I don't know, probably also in the United States, is that Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. His plan is to create a greater Russia, and to negotiate with Putin would be appeasement policy, which was doomed against Hitler. These historical analogies are being made. Why is this narrative wrong in your eyes?
Well, because the real context is that the American empire is the one that keeps expanding, or the intention of it. And by, that's a provocative phrase that Americans are not allowed to say. But the American military alliance, NATO, is the active agent here of expansion. And this counters all that was said to Gorbachev in 1990. It's a direct violation of common sense, as well as commitments that were made back in 1990, that as the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that in any way. And of course, the famous expression was not 1 inch eastward. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when that happened, because I was advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So this is, for me, not only history books, but being there. The United States, unbeknownst, of course, to me and to the world at the time, because everything is done secretly, said, okay, now we start expanding NATO. And from the early 1990s onward, this was set in motion. And our top diplomats warned repeatedly, don't do that. Our greatest diplomat of the age, George Kennan, after all, the author of Containment itself in 1947, said, do not expand NATO. Our Secretary of Defense at the time, William Perry, said, do not do this. Our ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, a wonderful diplomat, said, do not do this. This will start us down a path of new confrontation. What's interesting is that for the first few years, the first wave of expansion, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think Russia was very unhappy, but said, okay, that's Central Europe. But then the next swath under George W. Bush Jr. was, of course, right against the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia and Slovenia, 7 in one wave. The Russians said, stop this already. And Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. People should read the speech. Of course, not only do they not read the speech, our mainstream media absolutely tried to deflect us from any history, from any memory, from any context. But Putin said, stop expanding. You promised us no expansion. Now you keep expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous for our national security, what you're doing. So what was the US response? In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. insisted that NATO will go not only to Ukraine, but to Georgia. Okay, now it turns out this was part of a timeline that was already deeply set. This wasn't just George W. Bush Jr., though he didn't have to follow through. Zbig Brzezinski explained all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1997 in an article called Strategy for Eurasia. He even gave the timetable. He said Ukraine's membership will come between 2005 and 2010. And if you're experienced in US politics, you know an article in Foreign Affairs like that is not just some author's thinking, it's a reflection of what is in train. Little bit trial balloon, but mainly explanation of the timeline. Now, in 2008, European leaders were aghast at what Bush had done. And some of them talked to me. And they told me.
Angela Merkel
not
said,
Angela Merkel personally, no.
But she said at the time, if Ukraine would be part of NATO, this would be a cause for war for Russia. Even Merkel said it.
Exactly. So this was all known. And what is so sad about the European leaders is none of them tells the truth right now. They're all so scared of the United States or of their public or of the ability to manipulate the mass media and the perception from below or to speak out of line. But I know what they said because they said it to me. They said it to me personally. And by the way, just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of Europe's top leaders, I said to him, I won't go farther to say who, but I said, you know, the day Biden says NATO's not enlarging, then we really can get to the end of the war. And he said to me, I agree with you completely. And then he said exactly the opposite the next day, by the way, in public. So I know it from my own view. So this story, just to finish the story, the disaster, the fuse was lit in 2008, but then the US cannot stop playing games. That's the biggest problem. US foreign policy is covert. It's not that you can't figure it out, but it's secret, it's deniable. And so what happens in 2014 in February? The United States, together with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine, worked together to overthrow Yanukovych. Clear as can be. And not only that, thanks to the services of Russia, we even have it on tape with Victoria Nuland talking to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat about who the next government will be. Basically 4 weeks before Yanukovych is violently overthrown. And they pick the next prime minister and explain why. It can't be Klitschko, it's got to be this one. And it just went down that way. And our newspapers, oh, they won't say a word about it. It's on tape. Oh, that doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can ignore everything. So that's when the explosion came. The war started with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Now, oh, so many people, Sachs, you know, what a Putin apologist, what a conspiracy theorist. Of course, people, if you don't look a little bit or people don't tell you things, then you don't know. But let me advise people, just for example, there's a very nice book written by a very fine scholar in 2017 called Covert Regime Change. And it's about US foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. And it documents 64 covert regime change operations of the US government. So That's the business of the US government, overthrowing other governments. They're called covert, but there's a lot of trace. I've been actually in places where governments have been overthrown. I watched, and then I see that the New York Times won't even report the story because it's a game from the US point of view. So in February 2014, the US again engaged in a regime change operation and thought we can get away with it. Now we have a pro-NATO government. We've just overthrown the neutral government. Now we have a pro-NATO government. And immediately the new government says, yeah, we want to join NATO. And immediately the arms flows start from the United States, billions of dollars of arms flows. And this continues through Trump. It continues through the uprisings in the Donbass. It continues with Russia taking back Crimea. And then in 2021, we have a new president who some of us thought would be sane and responsible. He's probably sane, but he's completely irresponsible. And 3 times in 2021, the United States government recommitted to Ukraine's membership in NATO at the highest levels in big security documents, as well as in the NATO summit in 2021. And that's when Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 a draft agreement for new security arrangements between the US and Russia. And Putin kept saying, by the way, look, you're putting Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. They're a few minutes from Moscow. What are you putting in those missile chambers? We don't even know, because you backed out of the ABM treaty, you backed out of the INF treaty. And so Putin's got a point. And now the US wants to move up to the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia. And for those who still think that this is, anyone who reads anything knows that this is a 30 years process. This is not about Putin reconstructing the Russian Empire. That's a nice little joke told by the US security state, as opposed to any of the things I've just described. But if you just go online and look at the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st, 2022, you get a perfectly plain explanation of what this military operation is about, because Putin goes around the room and calls on everybody, and calls on Lavrov, among others, and says, Minister Lavrov, what is the situation with our proposals for security arrangements? And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we put them on the table, and the United States has given us the formal notice that it will not negotiate on these points, and that as a formal principle, the United States will not discuss NATO enlargement with Russia because it's none of our business, because that is the formal foreign policy doctrine of the United States of America. Well, I can't think of a stupider one, by the way, to say that NATO enlargement, with all that it entails, up to Russia's border is none of Russia's business, so we don't even discuss it with Russia. Well, you might think a war could break out as a result of that, and it has.